Let's take a look at another weakening question. Here, starting with the question stem, which one the following if true would count as evidence against the scientist's explanation of Earth's warming? Evidence against. Weakening. Scientist's explanation of Earth's warming. There, the question stem is telling you to invoke the phenomenon hypothesis framework. The phenomenon is Earth's warming. The scientist's hypothesis, here the word explanation is used in lieu of hypothesis. Okay, so let's take a look at the stimulus. The scientist says Earth's average annual temperature has increased by about half a degree Celsius over the last century. So over the last 100 years, from 19 whatever to 20 whatever, the last 100 years, average annual temperature has gone up by half a degree Celsius. That's the phenomenon. Now, we want to tell a causal story that explains this phenomenon. That we're going to call the hypothesis. The scientist tells the story. The scientist's story is that this warming, right, referential phrase, referencing this entire phenomenon, is primarily the result. Now, the scientist here, notice, speaks actually kind of like a scientist, right? She's not saying is only the result, primarily. As is the case when it comes to complex phenomenon, there are lots of different causal factors. Right? We're not talking about some, trash can getting tipped over and trash everywhere. That's a pretty simple phenomenon. Probably, it's possible that the cat and dog conspired to commit this vile act, but more likely it's just one of those idiots did it, right? But here, when we're talking about the temperature of the entire globe, of its entire Earth warming, it's more likely that there are many causes, and the scientist is careful, is measured in her hypothesis, saying this warming is primarily the result of buildup of minor gases in the atmosphere blocking the outward flow of heat from the planet, right? How did this happen? Did the sun get hotter? Maybe, but not primarily because of that, right? Primarily, it's because of these minor gases that built up in our atmosphere that act as a blanket that prevent the outward flow of heat from the planet. That's her hypothesis. Now remember all the different ways that I mentioned that you can engage with this. First, of course, is just to identify any assumptions, right? Identify any assumptions. And all of the subsequent methods of engagement, you can also think of as assumptions as well, right? The second thing I mentioned was, I think, the getting clear on the chronology, right? Make sure that the chronology is right. Causes have to precede effects. So here, in her hypothesis, tease out the cause and the effect. What's the cause here? The cause is the buildup of minor gases. What's the effect? The effect is global warming. Okay, so it must be the case that the cause precedes the effect. If it's not, that counts as weakening. Now we can keep going. I said in more challenging questions, they play around with the idea of prediction. Not all hypotheses make predictions, but certain hypotheses do make predictions. There's no explicit prediction made, but given the hypothesis is what it is, look, she's saying global warming is primarily caused by the buildup of minor gases, then a prediction that naturally falls out of this is that if we reduce the buildup of minor gases, right, or even reverse the buildup of minor gases, then you'd expect temperatures to go down, right? And then we can, I don't know how we can check to see if that's true in the world, right? Not over some long time frame, but maybe there's some ways to approximate it, right? You can say we run some computer models, some simulations where buildup of minor gases is reduced or reversed, and in those models, lo and behold, the planet's annual average temperature drops, right? Well, that would count as support for her hypothesis. Okay, so that's just kind of starting to think along those lines. And then, of course, we can talk about alternate hypothesis. Well, you think it's primarily because of this. Actually, I think it's primarily because of that, right? That's a very simple model where you're taking the primary cause, right? The primary cause is and as a critique, as a way to weaken, you're just saying that's not the primary cause. Something else is the primary cause. Fine, simple, right? Okay, so with this in mind, let's look at the answers. We'll start with A. Only some of the minor gases whose presence in the atmosphere allegedly resulted in the phenomenon described by the scientists were produced by industrial pollution. So all of this, this is just a grammatical chore. What's the subject? Gases. All gases? Nope. Minor gases. All minor gases? No. Only some of the minor gases. Okay, only some of the minor gases. Unqualified. Nope. Only some of the minor gases whose presence in the atmosphere allegedly resulted in the phenomenon described by the scientists. That very specific, narrow subset of gases. In other words, we're saying whatever these minor gases that you're talking about are the ones that are being alleged to have caused the global warming, only some of those gases came from industrial pollution. Okay, that's true, right? Answer question stem is telling us to take every answer choice to be true. Fine, that's true. Not all of them came from industrial pollution. Only some of them came from industrial pollution. Fine, but what does that have to do with this hypothesis being true or false? Does this argument care where the minor gases came from? It's just saying that it's the result of the buildup of the minor gases. Why are you talking about where the minor gases came from? Their provenance has no bearing on whether they're causing global warming. It's not relevant, right? You can kind of see this if you just toggle this assumption the other way. You just say something like, okay, you know what? Forget it. It's not only some of them. All of the minor gases came from industrial pollution. Okay, are they having this effect or aren't they having this effect? Right? You toggle it the other way. None of the gases came from industrial pollution. Again, are they having this warming effect or are they not having this warming effect? That's how you show an answer choice isn't the right answer choice. It's because if you stated this claim in some different way, it has no effect on the argument, just like how it's stated currently has no effect on this argument. Okay, let's keep going. We'll look at answer choice B, which says most of the warming occurred before 1940, while most of the buildup of minor gases occurred after 1940. What do you think about this one? The warming, right? That's the thing we're trying to explain. Most of it occurred before 1940. That's the effect. The putative cause is the buildup of minor gases, but most of that occurred after 1940. Well, that's problematic for the hypothesis because that's pointing at the chronology. You got the chronology wrong. B counts as evidence against the scientist's explanation. B weakens the argument. You see, in the framework, right? Like if you look at the framework of assumption, and in fact, even kind of further out, you look at the framework of, this phenomenon is said to support this hypothesis. Okay, how strongly, right? Where do we put it on the spectrum from consistent over here to strongly implied? Right? I mean, again, you land somewhere over here, just like the previous question, because that's, all weakening questions do this. They give you this stimulus, which is just like, okay, yeah, these premises have some support for this conclusion, right? This is not a crazy conclusion to follow from these premises. So there's some support, but it's never that great. And it's never that great precisely because it makes a bunch of assumptions. One assumption this argument makes, right? In other words, for this hypothesis to truly explain this phenomenon, one assumption of many, one of them is that the warming did not occur before the gases built up. Because how can you have an effect occur before a cause, right? And that's exactly what B does. B says, yeah, you know what, that assumption, I'm going to turn it on its head. I'm going to say that the warming did occur before your cause, your buildup of gases occurred. Well, now this argument is no longer that great, right? In fact, with B being true, I think we push the support structure of this argument to over here now, to the other side of consistent. Now it seems like I actually don't think this is the right argument. Or sorry, not the right explanation, rather, not the right hypothesis. You don't have to, right? Nothing like, you don't have to be that dramatic. You could just weaken it a little bit. That's fine too, as we saw in the previous question. But surely you could weaken it by a lot. But the point is you have to weaken it. And B does that, whereas A doesn't. And we'll see the other answer choices also don't. C says, over the last century, Earth received slightly more solar radiation in certain years than it did in others. Doesn't this sound exactly like an alternate hypothesis? Doesn't this also work? Aren't we saying, wait, hold on. Why are you saying it's the buildup of minor gases that caused global warming? Couldn't it just be the sun got hotter? We got more solar radiation. That's what caused this temperature increase, that the phenomenon that we're trying to explain. Okay, so there are two things I want to say in response to that. First of all, note that it's actually harder to go this route when you're talking about a complex phenomenon with an admittedly complex, multi-factored causal route. The scientist already said the phenomenon is primarily explained by something else, meaning she's already leaving room for other causes to play a role. So merely bringing up a potential alternate cause doesn't quite do the work that you want it to do in terms of weakening, right? Like alternate cause would do a lot more work in weakening if the scientist was more rigid in the way she explained it. She's like, this warming is solely due to the buildup of minor gases. I mean, if she backed herself into a corner like that, well then, yeah, you can just bring up some alternate cause. That dramatically weakens the argument more. than if she already conceded the territory. She already accommodated potential other contributing causes, right? So that's the first point I want to make, is you got to know when to go down this route. The second point I want to make is that you didn't even go down this route correctly. C is saying something very different. C is not saying that over the last 100 years, the Earth has progressively gotten more solar radiation. Okay, C is merely saying that over the last 100 years, the amount of solar radiation Earth received wasn't exactly constant from year to year to year. That's all it's saying. The Earth received slightly more solar radiation in certain years than it did in other years. Okay, which of the years did it receive more solar radiation than the other years? I don't know. And if I think about it, this seems completely normal. Of course, the amount of solar radiation the Earth receives in one year compared to the next year will be different. And it'll be different still the following year and different again the next year. Because, that's just how the universe works. How strange would it be if from year to year the Earth received exactly the same amount of solar radiation? That would be pretty freaky. Right? Now, the crucial point, again, is that what C needed to say, or the version that C was kind of baiting you into thinking, was that, look, from the negative 100 years ago to now, right? That's the last 100, over the last century. The amount of solar radiation Earth received increased progressively. Right? That's what C is baiting you to think. If C had actually said that, sure, that would be potentially another causal factor to consider. Maybe it's the buildup of minor gases, maybe it's the amount of solar radiation the Earth received, right? And I already mentioned that even if C has said that, why it wouldn't be so effective weakening it, because the author already conceded that it could be other causal contributions. But really the point I'm trying to make is that C is not even saying this. C just says Earth. So really the map could look something like like this, right? Could look something like this. From year to year, you're getting different amounts of solar radiation, and that's normal. And what bearing does that have on whether buildup of minor gases is the cause of global warming that we measured? The answer is no bearing at all. D is doing something very similar. Volcanic dust and other particles in the atmosphere reflect much of the sun's radiation back into space before it can reach Earth's surface. D is also trying to bait you into thinking down this road of alternate hypothesis. Well, hold on, is it really the buildup of minor gases in the atmosphere, or is it actually this other stuff, this dust and other particles that have a cooling effect on the Earth, right? But it's doing, once again, a horrible job. Just like answer choice C, even if it did the thing that it was supposed to be doing, like the fact that the author already conceded that this is the primary renders this kind of, not very powerful. But again, I want you to pay attention to what D is actually saying. D just says volcanic dust and other particles have a cooling effect on Earth. That's it. It doesn't tell us whether over the past 100 years, do we have more volcanic dust or less volcanic dust? If you actually wanted to weaken this argument, you'd have to say something like, over the last 100 years, we've experienced a dramatic reduction in the amount of volcanic dust and other particles in the atmosphere. In other words, over the last 100 years, the stuff that was blocking the sun's radiation, that stuff is gone, right? So in other words, more of the sun's radiation got to Earth, which that might be the explanation of why the Earth got hotter. And you don't have to appeal to your minor gas buildup theory. But notice that that's not what D says at all. D doesn't tell you if over the past 100 years we got more volcanic dust or less volcanic dust. It just tells you that, oh, volcanic dust, yeah, that reflects sun's radiation. Well, great. My butt also reflects the sun's radiation back to space. My butt is the protector of the Earth's surface from sun's harmful radiations. How do you like that? And lastly, E says the accumulation of minor gases in the atmosphere has been greater over the last century than at any other time in Earth's history. Okay, E is kind of trying to lead us down this prediction route. See, if this were true, if this hypothesis were true, that it's truly the buildup of minor gases, then you can actually make a prediction. You can be like, hey, do we have data from, going back further than 100 years? Do we have data going back 500 years? Can we look at the data from, say, negative 500 years ago to now, right? So this is negative 100. Can we look at the data from maybe this period? How much gas buildup did we experience in this period? And then compare that data against what the temperature did over that same period. That's going down the prediction route. If your hypothesis is true, then what you would expect is that if in this period, right, not the period that we're talking about, but rather even further back, if in this period we didn't have as much gas accumulation, then we'd also expect to see from the temperature data that there wasn't as much warming, right? That's the way to do this route correctly. That would either corroborate the hypothesis or hurt the hypothesis, depending on how the data turned out. I say this as a way for you to contrast the right way to do it against the way that E did it. E merely said that in the last 100 years, the accumulation of minor gases has been greater compared to any other, and you compare it against any other 100-year stretch in Earth's history. None of it compares against how much we accumulated the last 100 years. Okay, fine, but that's only half the story. I need to know also that the 0.5 degrees Celsius temperature increase is correspondingly greater than any of those other periods in order to corroborate the hypothesis, or alternatively, to weaken the hypothesis, I need to show that that's not the case. That, oh, you know what? Even though in the last 100 years, we've had greater buildup of minor gases than, say, from negative 500, negative 400 years ago, it was back then that temperature warmed up even more. See, that will weaken the argument. But as it stands, E is, I don't know what it's doing. It's tempting me to supply the remainder of the story, but you only told half a story, and that's not enough to weaken the argument.